Hello, my name is Anthony Luscri, Kilo 8 Zulu Tango, and the topic of this presentation is Youth and Amateur Radio. Information and resources for clubs or individuals interested in working with youth in amateur radio. You can view the expanded version of this slideshow at tiny.cc/YIAR. There you'll have access to the full slideshow plus all the links that are presented in today's talk. Looking around at a hamfest or club meeting, you will get the definitive and most likely accurate impression that the ham radio population as a whole is graying. Rich Moyson, W2VU, editor of CQ Magazine. And I think if you look at your local club, you may see something very similar. Defining youth and amateur radio. I suggest focusing on a broad age group. Anyone under 26 years of age will be considered youth for the purposes of this talk, with three distinct groups: students in grades 4 through 8, high school students, college students, and recent graduates in that age group. Of course, approaches and focuses will be different with each of the different age groups. Some of the different age group focuses: students in 4th grade through 8th grade tend to work well in groups. For exposure, classroom demos, something I call Radio Day, which I'll explain a little bit more in detail. It's more of a virtual field trip where you go to them as opposed to them going on a field trip, and stresses integration with school subjects, activities, STEM education, etc. High school and college students, it's more focused on recruiting individual students, recruitment in specific majors or classes that might have a high interest in amateur radio. Stress career paths, networking opportunities, etc. Licensing classes followed by mentoring. Operating opportunities, especially contesting, can be very important for this age group. Historic amateur radio paths for youth include shortwave listening, scouting programs, school radio clubs, and of course a family member that is already a ham. We're not going to be able to deal too much with the fourth one, so we'll drop that for now and focus on the first three. Shortwave listening. Unfortunately, there's been a decrease in broadcasting worldwide and a decrease in general programming. Hams are now almost exclusively on single sideband as far as voice communications go, so there's no reception available on the typical commercial shortwave AM receiver that a student might find in his home. Scouting programs, there's been large decreases in the number of both troops and youth entering scouting groups. School radio clubs are not as common as they used to be, and it's not just radio clubs, it's school clubs in general have been in a great decline, especially after school clubs. My personal experience in amateur radio started as a youth. I was interested in science and geography, especially maps. I got interested in electronics and radio in junior high, and I read magazines was the main source of my information. And I convinced my parents to buy me a Christmas gift of a radio, a shortwave kit that I built, but no license. I didn't know a ham, so I had no idea how to study or get licensed. I was intimidated by the Morse code requirements, and the cost of a new radio equipment was prohibitive for a teenager in my time. In 1981, after college and marriage, my wife Linda saw that there was an ad in the local paper for an amateur radio class. We went together to weekly Morse code class, and we passed our novice test in the summer of 1981. I passed my tech that fall. I joined the local radio club that had sponsored the class and became very active. My first HF activity began in 1983. So even though over a decade after I graduated from high school, I finally got involved with amateur radio. Some common myths about amateur radio and youth. One of the first myths is that you have to have a youth club at the school to get involved. That's not the case. Your interaction with youth may be on a very individual basis, or it might be on an annual basis with activity at the school. But having a club is not necessarily the first thing you start out with. And licensing is everything is definitely a myth. The whole idea is exposure, and if you do finally get the licensing, is even more important than licensing is the process of mentoring, where you actually get people on the air, not just get them a license. And a lot of us have the myth that everyone given the opportunity wants to jump and become a ham. Even though we had a great desire to become hams, not everyone you meet, especially in the school, will be interested in becoming a ham. So you have to realize that going in. And it's not always love at first sight. Sometimes your introduction to a fourth or fifth grader might not take effect until many years later, as in the case of me not getting my license for quite a few years after my first exposure. And a lot of us have the idea that high school is the best age. It's probably the worst age, actually, because students are busy with other activities. As far as introduction goes, it's much more effective at getting students introduced in fifth or sixth grade and getting them started. Now, that doesn't mean that a club at a high school could not be successful, but I think you're going to find in most cases that's based on students who've started much earlier in the program. So you need to get to the students before high school. Some other myths that you must have an outside antenna to even listen, and I'll show you how you can get around that with online shortwave software-defined radios, and also that you even need to have a radio to listen. There's this idea that kids need simplified content. That's not really the case. They need to understand the terminology for amateur radio because it'll be unique to them, but as far as the science and math goes, you'll find that sometimes many kids are much quicker to pick up the information than adults are. There's also this idea that voice is the preferred mode for demos, and I think you'll find that that's definitely a myth, as a lot of times kids are used to talking on phones and don't see the voice demonstrations with radio very interesting or very exciting. So many times a digital demonstration can be a lot more exciting for kids, and even a CW demonstration if you have a way of displaying the decoded CW for them in a way that they can read. There's also this myth that contesting isn't for kids. Well, if you look around and see what kids are involved in, a lot of it is competition in the form of video games and sports. So contesting is actually a great way to get kids involved in radio. Another myth is that everything is surface mount now, so no one ever builds anything. And there are small kits available, very inexpensive. When we found out our kids very much enjoyed the idea of learning how to do soldering. CW is not dead. A lot of kids like the idea of learning CW. It's a secret code that they're learning, and it's something very interesting to them. And there's this whole idea that money and grants are available. Then XYZ company will obviously want to donate money to your school radio club, and that's not at all the case. So don't count on being showered with money once you start this club. A good thing you're going to want to do is probably provide money from your local club, and maybe some donations from members of your club, and equipment donations can be very helpful, but don't expect a ton of grants available to you. So where do you connect to youth? Well, I've got three different ideas here. The first is schools, which we'll talk about in a lot more detail, and then some other organizations besides schools, such as scouting groups, youth groups, and community organizations. That could also include things such as a library, a boys or girls club, other things in that nature. And then directly is one of the most effective ways. If you can connect directly with individual kids that are highly identified as being likely to get interested in amateur radio. So directly through friends and family. Kids are involved in social media, so that's a great way to reach out to kids. Radio club recruitment. With the older kids, college level, professional organizations can be a great way. If you can show a college student the potential for networking available in amateur radio to further their high-tech career, it can be invaluable. And probably one of the biggest areas where we directly come in contact with youth is at our annual field days, where we do them in public and people just stumble upon us. So that's another good possibility. To get involved with any of these specific groups, you need to get your foot in the door first. And so I want to talk about some ideas for getting your foot in the door for schools, homeschoolers, scouting, youth groups, and other community organizations. One of the most important things is probably the fact that you need to present a professional appearance. So I describe this as don't dress for a ham fest. Your dress, your actions, your preparation, etc., will all be judged by the groups you're trying to approach to get a foot in the door. And you need to make sure you do it right the first time. Not everyone in your club is a good candidate for youth outreach or working with schools. Don't just assume existing club education or program or licensing instructors are always the best fit for youth outreach. You might find that another person who has a background in education might be much more successful in getting your foot in the door. Remember, there's room for other people to participate, but right now we're talking about getting our foot in the door, the initial appearance that we present to these organizations. When you approach these organizations, you need to talk about what you can do as hams to support activities that the school is already involved in, not the approach at look at all the great things we do, or questioning them, why aren't you doing this? Or you did this before, why aren't you doing it now? Definitely not the way to win friends and influence people. One approach is to piggyback on current high interest in STEM or STEAM, science, technology, engineering, art, and mathematics, and the DIY do-it-yourself movements in education. These are really popular, and these are great ways to get amateur radio foot in the door. I've developed some materials for marketing, and there's also some materials available from the ARRL. I have a brochure called Ham Radio, the Original Maker Movement. It's a trifold brochure. You can click on the links and print out as many copies as you like. And then there's also brochures available from the ARRL. Just remember, even though they're free, it takes a little while for them to be delivered, so make sure you order them in plenty of time to have them available if you plan on distributing these. Possibilities to focus on also include connections with space, such as the Aries program and a new program that's being developed called Youth on Amateur Satellites. There's a mistake in the slide here. I'll fix that. So Youth on Amateur Satellite Activity. The Jamboree on the Air, or JOTA, is a great place to interact with scouts. It's an annual event that occurs in October, and it's also all types of scouting groups, not just the Boy Scouts, but also Cub Scouts, Girl Scouts, and other scouting groups. There's resources available in the links on the page here. Speaking of scouting and other youth organizations, the Boy Scouts of America and most public schools and other groups require training or background checks for adult volunteers working with youth. The Boy Scouts of America has a free program that I suggest all volunteers take. You can register for the program. You have to register, but it's free to take it. And there's also other organizations that have youth protection programs available for free that you can take part in. Youth protection is an issue that needs to be addressed by all hams working with any youth group. You need to check with your local schools or other groups for additional requirements. Some require FBI or BCI checks. Always follow the guidelines from these youth protection programs when providing youth activities at club activities or even at your home when you're doing events for youth. And again, here's a list of some of the free programs available out there for youth protection training. Let's talk a little bit now about demonstrating amateur radio for youth, and have some examples here. One I'm going to talk about, Radio Day, I'll talk about in a lot more detail, and it's designed for 5th through 8th grade students. Scouting event badge classes, scouting and merit badge classes are a great way to do demonstrations. And then community demonstrations. We already talked about Field Day, but also having a booth at a county fair or other community events is a great way to get amateur radio out to the public and hence to youth. This is the slide for Student Radio Day, and I have a handout, and then I also have teacher material. So let's click on these links to take a look at those real quickly here. This is the handout that I provide to the students. It has a number of links for resources, including some of the ones I've already mentioned, such as the trifold brochure, but it has a wide variety of things here, including the Zach and Max comic books, collection of radio resources, on-air tunable software-defined radios. It also has a little thing on the phonetic alphabet, a little step-by-step decoding tool or encoding tool for sending Morse code. Of course, this is not the way you're going to learn to get your CW on the air, but this is a great thing for a one-time only event with kids. Have a little diagram of radio that you might use to explain, a block diagram of how radio is set up. Then information on different frequencies, what type of activities are on different frequencies, garage door openers, baby monitors, cell phones, etc. Section on the prefixes we use for the different thousand, million, billion, the metric the metric prefixes, diagram of a wavelength of a wave cycle and demonstrating wavelength changes versus frequency, and then another little chart on the electromagnetic spectrum and a diagram of the frequencies for amateur radio, including where some of the specialty modes are. So again, that goes out to the kids. That's the handout, and that might be on paper, it might be done electronically. Here's the link that would be provided to the teachers ahead of time as a planning document to work with the teachers on what you're going to do on that particular day, what's going to happen, who's going to volunteer, what type of equipment might we be bringing in, what topics we have available, and I always have more topics than we can do in a day so that the teachers can pick the individual topics that they'd like to have us cover. I have different content area possible topics in math, science, social studies. In math, things like inverse proportional fractions to calculate wavelength versus frequency, science, electromagnetic spectrum, or we might talk about satellites in space, how radio works. Those are all good possibilities for science. Social studies, different types of map projections, including polar, countries and cultures, historical relationships between countries, general geographic information, etc. Language arts, things such as the phonetic alphabet, Q symbols. And you notice that there's all different subjects, not just math and science. Music, frequency and pitch. We could also send Morse code with drums, high and low notes, Doppler shift for older kids, data rates and compression of digital processing for MP3s and that sort of thing for older kids, art designing QSL cards, world languages, physical education demonstrating wavelength and frequency with jump ropes, and there's tons of materials on tech subjects. So again, I would provide this information to the teacher ahead of time so that we could concentrate on what they wanted to cover on radio day in their class. Radio day, I typically come in, we bring all the kids together from that grade level, and I do a presentation with an introduction to amateur radio. Then we do the hands-on activities, demonstrations, and the classes throughout the day. So all those things take place in one day. I provide material ahead of time in the form of online resources on what is amateur radio so that the teachers can share this with their students, amateur radio resources for youth, information on the phonetic alphabet, information on online software-defined radios that the kids can tune themselves. I have a whole link here on that information. And it's a great thing because a lot of times you need activities where the students can be working by themselves when you're working with large groups. And many of the schools have tablets or Chromebooks or computers or other devices where you can have a whole class individually tuning radios separately. Morse code, as I mentioned earlier, is often of interest to kids. And this is a little hands-on project where we design clothespin-based keys, and then the kids can actually send Morse code back and forth to each other. Plan your radio operations. Anyone can talk around the world with a simple cell phone today, so sometimes the lure for just voice communications is not that great. But if we add a few things to it, it suddenly becomes much more interesting. If we show them diagrams of maps of where we're talking in the world, show them spots on DX or reverse beacon clusters. Things like PSK Reporter can show them where our digital signals are getting out. So try and make your information visual in addition to whatever you're displaying. With Morse code, if you have a radio that can decode Morse code, they could view it on the screen of the radio, which of course would be difficult for a whole group of students. If you have a TS590SG, Kenwood has a free program that you can then display on an LCD projector showing the same data that you're decoding on the computer in the form of a program that could be easily viewed by the whole class. And plan your radio operations by using a lot of visuals. So I like to always have maps with me and charts. Consider all different modes of operation for your demonstrations. I mentioned earlier, phone contacts are very easy to do, and they might not impress the students as much. CW, of course, won't be understood by ear by the students, but if you can visually display code to them, it's a way for them to do it. And then even just having them learn the call sign that they're going to be listening for, it can be enough. So I just instruct them. I send my call sign so they get to recognize it. Also, what CQ sounds like, what 73 sounds like, what Roger sounds like. So when I respond to a station, all they're listening for is the station coming back with my call sign, and they'd be able to pick that out very quickly. So CW is a viable alternative for demonstrations. And here's some more information on CW as a code that students can learn, and also in addition to the clothespin key, a thumb texting key which they could also build. Digital modes are good for mic-shy youth, especially with their experience with texting. So PSK31 or FT8 or FT4 can be very good, especially with their visual computer-based appeal. Things like PSK Reporter, even if you aren't making contacts, they'll be able to see where stations are hearing you around the world. Satellite operation can be somewhat difficult to do with this very short passage of time for the satellites. But one thing about them is, unlike propagation on the HF bands, we know exactly when the satellite's going to be overhead, so we can schedule that. And I usually tell the students, I'm sure we'll be able to hear something. I can't guarantee we're going to be able to have a two-way contact. But it is a great activity. And one great thing about satellites for youth is technician class licensing, the beginning license that students could get. They could immediately have full privileges to operate all of these low Earth orbit satellites, which are very easy to work with a dual band FM radio. The whole idea of competition and gaming is very attractive, so bring that aspect into your thing if you can. We've done a variety of different things with our local student club, doing eyeball QSO parties where I hand out QSO cards from my collection, and then that student acts as that station, and they're actually yelling back and forth in our meeting room, making contacts, eyeball-based QSOs, and we give them an exchange they have to exchange, and they, of course, use the phonetic alphabet to improve the ability of the other stations to copy them. So it's a great activity without any need for licenses or radios at all. If you're planning on having demonstration QSOs where the kids are talking on the air, make sure they understand what they're going to be saying, have visuals so they know how to do the phonetic alphabet of your call sign, make sure they know the phonetic alphabet, how to spell their name, so if they need to give their name phonetically. And it's important to find a good station on the other end who's strong, readable signals, and is very much interested in communicating with the kids, not just the random person you pick up. So it's not wrong to do pre-planned scheduling. Also, consider having a backup plan, someone else from your club who might be available as a station that you could easily make contact with, who has prearranged questions that they're going to be able to ask the kids and has good propagation to your location. And pick out someone who talks well with kids and can relate to them with subjects and information that might be interesting to them. You always need to have a plan B in case of problems with your demonstration. Maybe your antenna is not working properly, your radio is acting up. So have backup equipment, have multiple bands available, have other modes available. I remember one time I was doing a demonstration for a very large group at a school, and the bands were just really bad. There had been a flare that day, and I could not bring anyone up on phone, but I was able to eke out an FT8 contact, and the kids didn't know wasn't what I was planning on demonstrating. So they thought it was great that we were able to make a contact. Again, having that plant station out there can be very helpful when you run into situation B where you have problems. I mentioned earlier the ability to use online short SDRs, software-defined radios, that are tunable by the kids themselves and available with any type of device such as a computer, a tablet, or even their phones. And it's a great thing that you can send home with the students so they can continue after you do the demo. Fox hunting is a great activity. It doesn't require the persons participating to be licensed, just the person setting up the fox, and it's a great activity for kids. Soldering turned out to be the second most popular activity with our club at our junior high level. We picked up a bunch of 99-cent to $2 kits on eBay, and we also scavenged parts from old electronic equipment where we desoldered and then they could solder things. So they had fun doing the soldering. Drones and robotics are two other great ideas. Also, launching balloons is another possibility. Videos. Kids love videos. A lot of these kids, especially in that junior high or early tweens, love watching YouTube videos. So find suitable videos for them to watch. Maybe even make your own videos. If things go well with the school, you might be able to plan future visits, add additional buildings within the same school district, and even at some point in time, start a club in the school. To do that, though, you're going to need to have someone who's very interested in supporting that process. Also, consider providing physical resources to the school in things such as books for their library, and not just technical books, but also some fictional titles that might be useful and interesting for kids that have to do with amateur radio and radio technology in general. I provide the Zach and Max comic books available as links so that the teachers can have them available to kids, both the color versions and the black and white color book versions to them. What else can you do? What else can I do? As the Ohio Assistant Youth Coordinator, I'm happy to work with clubs or individuals in my state. If you're not in the state of Ohio, go ahead and search for your state youth coordinator. If your state doesn't have a youth coordinator, contact your section manager and let them know that you're interested in working with one, so that they need to think about appointing someone. And again, question and answers are now available. This presentation, with all of 120 plus slides, is available at tiny.cc/YIAR. If you need a PDF version of this, click on the link here. Please feel free to contact me via email or visit my website. I also have a link here at tiny.cc/K8ZT-P with some of the presentations I've done over the last year. Again, thank you, and we'll now continue with questions. Thank you.